I can think of few programs across the country with as much activity as Oklahoma has over the past few months since the transition from Lincoln Riley to, of course, Brent Venables. We got Parker Thune on the line. Please join him on 247 Sports. He covers OU recruiting, also the host at Sports Talk 1400 and 947 The Ref. Parker, how are you doing today?
Doing fantastic, Mark. Great to be here with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for breaking down the Sooners for us.
Of course.
Recent news coming in, 2023 wide receiver Gavin Freeman has committed to OU, correct?
Yeah, so Gavin Freeman's actually class of 2022. Oh. So he's signed with the Sooners' most recent recruiting class as a preferred walk-on. He was previously committed to Texas Tech on scholarship. Oklahoma legacy. His dad played tight end at Oklahoma in the mid-1990s. So OU was always kind of where he wanted to be. And with the staff that was formerly in place, Lincoln Riley and his assistants, there just never really was an opportunity for Gavin Freeman to make much of an impression upon them, although he did take several game day visits, obviously still having connections to the University of Oklahoma through his dad. He was on their radar, but not somebody that the old staff ever pursued. Lo and behold, Brent Venables and his assistants come to town, and one of their first orders of business is to start recruiting Gavin Freeman, offer him a preferred walk-on position, and basically on the spot, as soon as he had the offer in hand, he committed, reneged on his pledge to Texas Tech, and he'll be a Sooner.
Top 10 recruiting class again here in 2022, despite, of course, the typical fallout after there's a coaching transition. A lot of Sooner fans very worried for a couple of weeks about maintaining and holding ground. Your thoughts and impressions of Brent Venables and what he was able to do to maintain this top 10 class.
Yeah, well, it really is remarkable, Mark, when you think about the fact that, well, just consider for a moment the programs across the country that you would term blue bloods or at least regular powerhouses, right? And among those programs, the ones that had turnover in the coaching staff this particular season, or off season rather, you have OU and USC. Obviously, you also have Florida and Miami. And Oklahoma closed the 2022 cycle with the number 8 recruiting class in the country. That's unheard of for a program that undergoes such a massive change across the coaching staff, and particularly the loss of a head coach. Now, you look at USC, Florida, and Miami, those are 3 schools that were barely sniffing the top 20 in the overall recruiting rankings per our 24/7 Sports composite rankings. So for Oklahoma to land at number 8 when all this is said and done is pretty darn miraculous, Mark. And it's even more remarkable when you consider the fact that after Riley departed, OU had fallen as low as 21st in those rankings. And so the effect that Brent Venables and his staff had in an immediate sense on this program's capacity to recruit some of those targets down the stretch in 2022 that were still uncommitted or maybe were committed elsewhere and not entirely sold on their destination. Mad props to not only Venables, but his offensive coordinator, Jeff Lebby, who earned commitments from quarterback Nick Evers and wide receiver Jaden Gibson, both of whom were formerly committed to Florida within 5 days of taking the job as Oklahoma's new OC. Miguel Chavis, and that was a hire that a lot of people kind of turned their heads sideways at when Brent Venables decided to bring Chavis from an off-field role at Clemson into his first on-field coaching role as the defensive ends coach at Oklahoma. 3 of their 4 new additions on National Signing Day, new commitments, came from blue-chip players that Miguel Chavis primarily recruited to the University of Oklahoma. And obviously, Brent Venables was involved in that process. Todd Bates was involved in that process to a certain extent, but the impact that Miguel Chavis had on the Sooners' defensive recruiting down the stretch cannot be overstated. So all in all, it's really about as good as you could have realistically had it as far as recruiting down the stretch for Oklahoma in the class of 2022. And now you have some momentum to build off going into the class of 2023, where Oklahoma is expected to once again have a top 10 class and maybe even a class that surpasses their 2022 class in terms of their overall rankings in the 24/7 Sports composite.
Yeah, you could also throw Brian Kelly's transition to LSU into that collection of teams. And the one difference with Oklahoma would be you have a first-time head coach heading up that process versus the other examples you gave. And Oklahoma ranked higher than all of those schools. And also a coaching transition of very different coaches. And I think that may have also been a challenge for Brent Venables because of the defensive prowess that he obviously stacks his reputation on versus Lincoln Riley, and losing a certain type of player because Brent Venables has a reputation on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, it was very much a different flavor, isn't it? You have an offensive mastermind like Lincoln Riley walk out the door, and you replace him with arguably the most successful defensive coordinator in college football over the last 2 decades in Brent Venables. So I think the bottom line there is you're going to start to see Oklahoma recruit a different type of player in a general sense than Lincoln Riley was able to recruit. And I think the philosophy is also going to shift quite a bit, because with Venables, you heard it last week when he held his press conference with members of the media in the aftermath of National Signing Day. He said, look, you can't hide weakness up front, both on the offensive line and the defensive line. That's a weakness that you're not going to be able to conceal. Now, Lincoln Riley's MO was very much to build his team from the inside out, in a sense, where you recruit elite skill position players, put less of a focus on the trenches, and then hope that high scoring offenses and turnover heavy defenses are going to be able to lift you to Big 12 championships, college football playoff berths, eventually that elusive national title. Whereas for Brent Venables, it's going to be you recruit hard and solid on the offensive line and the defensive line, and that's your priority. And the 5 stars that you're pursuing, the elite blue chip guys, probably are going to be guys that can impact the game in the trenches for you. And then from there, you start to expand things to recruiting the skill positions on offense and defense. And that's a very easy thing to do these days just because of how much talent there is at those positions. And also, when you get a quarterback committed, generally there will be elite skill position guys, wide receivers, running backs that gravitate towards that quarterback. So as you look to 2023 for Oklahoma, they've already got Jackson Arnold, who may end up being a 5-star when all is said and done, committed at the quarterback position. They've already got a wide receiver that followed Arnold in Ashton Cozart, the 4-star wideout out of Marcus High School in Flower Mound, Texas. So you got a really solid nucleus at the offensive skill positions right there. And it's only going to get more and more talent rich for the Sooners in that perspective. But the key difference between the Riley recruiting philosophy and the Venables recruiting philosophy is just that. You're going to see Oklahoma pursue and have a stronger pitch for elite offensive linemen and defensive linemen than he did under the former administration.
Yeah, and depending on where the bar is placed, of course, Riley's super successful, but for those tough graders that are looking at college football playoff appearances, 3 losses and the last 2 were not competitive, mostly because of play in the trenches. We got Parker Thune on the line. You can catch him at 247 Sports, covers OU and recruiting right there. He's also a host at Sports Talk 1400 and at 947 The Ref. And just to play off of that and extend it a bit more, the feedback that we get from Oklahoma fans was, of course, the panic initially, and then the waiting game of who it's going to be, and then the mixed reaction of, okay, Brent Venables, yeah, known name in college football, but never been a head coach. Is he going to be able to, are we going to lose offensive skill position recruits? And now it seems to be a very strong surge of backing and support from the fan base of Brent Venables, who point out some of the things that you just touched upon, that they look on the shortcomings of the previous teams and think we're going to be more disciplined, we're going to be tougher minded, tougher physically, we're going to have maybe looking at the 2 head coaches, and I'm extending this to what many of the fan base has to say, maybe we're going to have more character players as well on these teams.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the emphases that Brent Venables has really pushed since he came to Oklahoma. And you don't have to look any further than the recruitment of Jaron Kanak to see evidence of that. And Jaron Kanak out of Hays, Kansas, 4-star guy, athlete, linebacker primarily, at least that's the position that he's going to play, we assume, at the University of Oklahoma. But he was committed to Clemson to play for Brent Venables. That was pretty much the long and the short of his affinity for Clemson University, was the fact that Brent Venables was the defensive coordinator there. Now, when Brent Venables took the head coaching job at Oklahoma, Kanak naturally started to have his questions about whether he still wanted to stay committed to Clemson. And this was a situation that the media grilled Venables on last week after National Signing Day, and he laid it all out. He said, look, I told Jaron, you can't come to Oklahoma. You need to stay committed to Clemson. Nothing's changed at Clemson. I'm not there, sure, but that's still Dabo Swinney's program. That's still a program that's going to win double-digit games year in and year out and be in contention for conference titles, national titles. You don't need to bounce from Clemson just because I'm not there. Now, what he also told Jaron Kanak was that, if Oklahoma is where you really want to be, then you're going to have to work it out with Dabo Swinney. You're going to have to get his blessing. And you're also going to have to come here without any pomp and circumstance. I'm not going to send you a national letter of intent. I'm not going to let you sign on early signing day. And you're going to have to just show up to campus in January, sign a financial aid agreement, and join the team in a very quiet fashion. And at the end of the day, that's what Jaron Kanak did. And I think a lot of Sooner fans are having a lot of fun contrasting that situation to the situation out in Los Angeles with their former head coach, who has poached several players from Oklahoma's roster in the aftermath. And so the stark contrast, I don't know if I would call it character just as much as decorum, but the stark contrast in the recruiting practices of Brent Venables versus Lincoln Riley, I think, is a comparison that a lot of people are having a lot of fun with right now.
So when you say poaching players, Parker, of course, Lincoln Riley was posed that question the other day concerning Oklahoma players that he transitioned and, of course, changed to from a technical standpoint, he's taking players out of the transfer portal. They have to enter the transfer portal. So, of course, he's rephrasing that. Oklahoma fans seem to be fixated on what's going on in Los Angeles with Lincoln Riley. I'm sure that's going to fade with time, and the wins and the losses are going to mount for both programs, and we'll see what happens there. I think Oklahoma is more of a steady, stable situation. We'll see if Lincoln Riley becomes the big splash that he is. Is he really the villain that he appears to be among Sooner Nation?
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. And I don't think it has anything to do with the fact that he left. I don't think Oklahoma fans are that petty. The rumor for years and years was that, hey, the Dallas Cowboys job, that's Lincoln Riley's dream job. And if that ever were available to him, he would take it. And I know there was some concern after the 2019 season when that Cowboys job came open that, oh, maybe Lincoln Riley's about to bolt for the NFL. And if that had been the case, I don't feel like Oklahoma fans would have had any beef with Lincoln Riley because they couldn't, right? He's taking what is ostensibly, at least in his eyes, a better job and a higher profile job. At that, the Dallas Cowboys are America's team after all. And I'm not necessarily limiting that discussion to the Cowboys. I think if Lincoln Riley had seen fit to take another job, nobody would have given that a second thought, and nobody would have held him responsible for the feelings of an entire fan base if he hadn't left the way that he did. I think it has less to do with the fact that he left and a lot more to do with the fact that he left the way he did. And what I mean by that, Mark, is that absolutely nobody knew that Lincoln Riley was even in conversation with USC. And I know he portrayed the whole spiel about how, the first time I ever talked to USC was that Saturday night after Bedlam, and 12 hours later, I decided to say yes. That's bogus. And everybody knows that's bogus. That's not a decision that gets made in 12 hours. That's not something that gets worked out from both ends in the span of 12 hours. And so he can continue to stand on that soapbox and proclaim as long as he wants that he never spoke to USC until after that Bedlam game on Saturday night. That's not the case. There's no way that's the case. And furthermore, to spring it on everybody the way that he did, which is to call a team meeting, walk in, stand in front of them for 2 or 3 minutes and say, hey, I'm leaving. That rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. The players in that locker room, his assistants, and most of all, the fan base, because they were so blindsided, especially after watching him stand on that podium on Saturday night after the Oklahoma State game, look everybody straight in the eye and say, I'm not going to be the next head coach at LSU. Then you turn around the next day and you're taking the USC job. So again, technically he never lied, but I think a lot of people felt misled. And particularly when you add up the somewhat mysterious circumstances of the previous few weeks. The fact that he was absent from the team for a day in preparation for the Baylor game, which they eventually lost, and it was not a pretty loss at all, very ignominious one. And so a lot of people in hindsight wonder what happened on that day. Was that maybe the day that he flew out to USC to interview? And there's a lot of speculation in that regard, and obviously it's not something we're ever going to have a clear answer to, but I don't think anybody would have an issue with Lincoln Riley if he had handled his departure the way that Brent Venables had handled his departure at Clemson, which is you give plenty of notice, you're transparent about the conversations that you're having with the other school, you don't make an effort to poach players from the other team's roster, and in general, you just handle the situation with class and with some respect towards the program that you poured years of your life into and that poured so much into you. And so that, I think, is the reason why Lincoln Riley has been vilified across this fan base and will continue to be vilified. Moreover, the things that he's saying in the public eye since he took the job at USC really haven't done him any favors in that capacity. So there's a lot of distaste for him. There probably will be for quite some time. And you mentioned you think it'll fade with time, Mark. I really don't get that sense, if I'm being completely honest. This is not something the fans are going to forgive and forget. So I think the only cure for this would be if he really falls flat on his face at USC and gets fired within the next 3 to 4 years, which I don't think that's happening. He's going to win out there. And I think that's going to be the hard thing for a lot of Sooner fans to swallow, is the fact that they're going to have to go and watch him win. He's going to have success at USC. But short of that, I think this is something that is going to be a thorn in the side of this fan base for a long, long time to come.
Yeah, you referenced the Baylor game, and from my memory, really the offense got rolling once Caleb Williams was inserted, of course, at halftime at the Texas game. And that Baylor game, sure, Dave Aranda built a really good defense, but man, that was a curious offensive and porous offensive performance and game plan, and a shoddy performance with just a couple touchdowns on the board. We got Parker Thune on the line from the Ref 947. 947 Sports, the Ref, Sports Talk 1400, and of course, catch his work at OU, the 247 Sports site there for OU, and also covering recruiting. Please like the video, share these videos out on social media. We figure if you enjoy the content, others will as well, and subscribe right here at the Voice of College Football. In this day and age, of course, with the transfer portal, it's tougher to project and predict a team's success, strengths and weaknesses in February than it's ever been. But that said, as we approach spring practice, your thoughts about 22 and what are the potential concerns for a team that's going to be rather talented and, of course, in the national picture?
Yeah, well, here's the thing, Mark. I think the biggest concern at this point in time is probably the offensive line, based on the way that they performed in 2021. And they bring in some reinforcements in the year 2022. The Cal transfer, McCade Mettauer, was a 3-year starter out there. He probably projects as an immediate replacement for Marquise Hayes at left guard. But that's still a position group that people are going to have to see some improvement from in order to buy that this team is not going to experience a significant drop-off and be able to maintain their double-digit win pace every single year the way that they have been since 2015, the first year that Lincoln Riley got there as offensive coordinator. Last time Oklahoma failed to win double-digit games in a season, well, the COVID year notwithstanding, when they went 9-2, but they've consistently been a top 10 program year in and year out, going all the way back to 2014. So I think it's really not that difficult to believe that this team isn't going to experience a significant drop-off, but if that's going to happen, if the Sooners are going to win 10, 11, 12, even 13 games next year, they're going to have consistent offensive line play up front. They're going to have to protect Dillon Gabriel. And also, I think you're going to have to – people are going to figure out real quick what type of quarterback Dillon Gabriel really is, because he was outstanding over his 3 seasons at UCF. One of the more productive quarterbacks across the country, 70-14 touchdown to interception ratio. So that's a guy that will keep the ball out of harm's way. But obviously, he's never gone up against Power 5 talent week in and week out. And with his former offensive coordinator, Jeff Lebby, at the controls for Oklahoma as the offensive coordinator, there is some familiarity there, and there is some reason for optimism that there won't be a huge drop-off offensively for Oklahoma. Obviously, the defense is going to get better. It's Brent Venables. If you look at his defenses statistically over the course of his career, and particularly over the course of his career at Clemson in the last decade, the guy's got a top 25 defense every single year. And in most cases, he's got a top 10 defense. So I expect that the Sooners are going to take a massive jump on the defensive side of the football, and they will be much more capable of winning games. I guess I'll put it this way. They will be able to win games with their defense as opposed to simply not losing games with their defense going forward. And if this team is going to contend for a Big 12 championship, which I believe they are, it starts up front with the offensive line. It starts with Dillon Gabriel at the quarterback position and getting engaged on exactly what he brings to the offense and the way that you need to scheme to best complement what he brings to the table and scheme to his success. And then you also got to figure out who the replacement for Kennedy Brooks is going to be in the backfield. And I don't think that's something that's probably being talked about enough, Mark, is who's going to be the bell cow in the Sooners backfield. And I'm convinced that at least for this year, it's going to be more of a committee approach, the likes of which we've seen before from Oklahoma in the past. Eric Gray was immensely productive in his 2 seasons at Tennessee before transferring to Oklahoma in the spring of 2021. He's the guy that probably projects as the one that heads up that backfield committee in the year 2022. Everybody's kind of waiting to see when Marcus Major is going to break out, because it seems like he's a guy that's gotten plenty of preseason buzz for 3 years now and has never really lived up to the billing. They bring in a couple freshmen in Gavin Sawchuk and Javante Barnes. I am really high on Barnes. I think he could have a very immediate impact for this team and could end up being maybe the most productive freshman running back at Oklahoma since Trey Sermon back in 2017. So I'm curious to see how things shake out and how the load is divided among those running backs. I would bet on Gray and Barnes probably comprising about 80 to 85% of that workload. You'll get a few touches for Major. Gavin Sawchuk will probably get a few touches here and there, but it comes down to how do you replace the 7 yards per carry that you're losing in Kennedy Brooks? And granted, Levy's offense isn't going to be as run heavy as Lincoln Riley's was, but college football really hasn't changed in the sense that you have to have a consistent running game in order to be successful, Mark. And I know a couple of years ago, Tua Tagovailoa and Joe Burrow came along, and it really seemed like the game was being revolutionized at that point. And the spread was taking over, and you didn't need a dynamic running back anymore in order to have success. And things have really regressed to the mean in that capacity over the last couple of years. And so Oklahoma is going to have to establish a consistent running game, regardless of what their offensive scheme looks like under Jeff Levy. So I think that's the 2 biggest questions for me are the offensive line and the running back position. And I'm just curious more than anything else to see just how good Dillon Gabriel is going to be at the Power 5 level.
And Parker, just to get back to your thought about Venables taking over the defense, of course, you win with the Jimmies and the Joes, but Alex Grinch was able to elevate a top 80 to 100 defense to a top 30 status there at Oklahoma. And of course, not having the track record that Brent Venables does, it's going to be intriguing to see if he's able to raise the level even more.
Yeah, you would think so, particularly with the talent that he's bringing back and the talent that he's brought in via the transfer portal. You think about a couple of real high-profile additions via the portal, and C.J. Colden, the defensive back from Wyoming, Trey Morrison, who was a 4-year starter at North Carolina, and then a guy that brings a really intriguing blend of skills in Jonah Laulu, the defensive lineman from Hawaii. And then you got Jeffrey Johnson from Tulane, who was arguably one of the most impactful defensive linemen across the entire group of 5 this past season. So the pieces are there for Brent Venables. I find it very hard to believe that Oklahoma is not going to have at least a top 20 defense next season with him at the controls.
Got Parker Thune on the line. Catch his work at 247 Sports, covering the Sooners, recruiting. Also, Parker, where can they catch you on air?
Yeah, so across the Sooner State, 94.7 FM, the Ref Sports Radio Network. That is the frequency for Oklahoma City and the surrounding areas. That signal will stretch for about an hour and a half radius, driving radius in every direction. We've got affiliates in Weatherford, Clinton, Medill, Ardmore. So really anywhere across the Sooner State, you can tune in to the Ref Sports Radio Network. In Norman, that frequency is 1400 AM. And you can always go to the web, the Sports Talk app, 947theref.com or sportstalk1400.com. I know it's where there are two different websites, but you go to either one, you'll end up finding us on air. I'm on air with Mike Steely every single day, weekday, that is, from 12 to 2, and then with Tyler McComas from 2 to 3. So you get to listen to me talk for 2 hours or 3 hours if you so desire via the Ref Sports Radio Network.
I'm sure there are worse things in life. Ever since this move of Oklahoma and Texas to the SEC has been announced, it's fun to kick around and kind of project, okay, how do these programs project to a higher level of play in the SEC? And let's not take this conversation, I think, to the point where a lot of people think the SEC is basically playing professional football and everybody else is just playing college football. And I don't see the difference to being that stark a difference. It's just a week-to-week grind. There is a better level of play with more teams that are playing top 25 to 35 football in the SEC. As Oklahoma currently stands, and of course we know that Brent Venables is transitioning the roster. It's going to be a different type of roster and player that's going to go into the SEC. How do you it's fun to kick around and look at, this is what Oklahoma's done previously for this 7 or 8 years dominating the Big 12. What would that have looked like to you in the SEC?
So you're talking basically what do you think they would have done under Lincoln Riley?
They lose an extra game per season on average.
I think that's a really interesting discussion. And to be honest with you, I don't have a great answer because look, if I'm being completely honest, I think the best answer I can give you is I think they probably would have been a 7-8 win team a year. Maybe they win 9 or 10 games if they get a favorable schedule. But I think the reality is over the course of the Lincoln Riley era, and you saw it whenever they had to go up against SEC teams in the postseason, they just weren't built to handle it. And they were the cream of the crop in the Big 12 for sure. But the SEC, as they say, it just means more, right? It's a whole different ballgame down there. And you got to be fearsome up front. That's one of the things that, like I said, Brent Venables is emphasizing, and they're going to have to emphasize because you can't get pushed around and win football games in the SEC. So I think that's the biggest thing for me as I look at what this team might have done in the SEC had they made the move 5 years ago is after 2018, when they had that tremendous offensive line that sent 5 starters to the NFL and they won the Joe Moore Award, anytime after 2018, I'm not convinced that the Sooners' offensive line would have held up. Their defensive line was star-studded as recently as this past season. You had Isaiah Thomas, Jalen Redmond, Nick Bonito, Perion Winfrey, all on that defensive line. They're all going to be day 1 or day 2 NFL draft picks. So I think there was a lot of talent on that defensive line. The scheming from Alex Grinch really didn't allow that defensive line to realize their full potential in Oklahoma's defense. So I think there were a lot of problems that this team had, both in terms of personnel and scheming, well, and culturally for that matter. But there were a lot of issues that this team had that I think were shielded or obfuscated by the reality that they were playing football in the Big 12, which, it's in years past, it's been neck and neck with the Pac-12 for the easiest football conference to navigate across the entire country in the Power 5. And so Oklahoma in the SEC over the last 5 years probably they maybe would have gotten to an SEC championship game at some point. I'm not convinced they would have won that conference at any point in time.
Well, I certainly think the Pac-12 has taken over that distinction. But the Big 12 certainly had its detractors 3 to 4 or 5 years ago, especially. I'll have to do an edit there. Parker Thune on the line from 247 Sports, breaking down OU and recruiting right there. Please check out his work. I got to say that I was a bit taken back by the initial response about the OU transition to the SEC. And of course, we'll never know. We will never know what would have happened. But this Oklahoma program's been 10-2 at worst, 11-1 most seasons since 2015, transitioning to the SEC. I think the real grind is not necessarily looking at, losing by 5 touchdowns to LSU and getting hammered by Alabama before making kind of a look good comeback in the second half, but that grind against the mid-level where Oklahoma's probably better in a one-game scenario, but when you play Arkansas, Auburn, Tennessee, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, etc., week after week after week after week, then you're going to get picked off, once every 4 to 5 games, that kind of deal. But when you said 7 or 8 wins, that I got to say that took me back a bit, because most people are in that 1 to 2 game projection of a downgrade in win totals per season.
Yeah, I'll say this much: it probably 7 to 8 is probably a little pessimistic. 8 to 9 is probably more realistic, but I think there definitely would have been years. I look at 2020, for example, where things could have spiraled out of control for the Sooners in a hurry in the SEC, because if they'd started 1-2 in the SEC that season, as they did in Big 12 play, man, I'm not sure they ever would have recovered. I'm not sure whether the culture in that locker room was conducive to that type of bounce back. And so I think there actually would have been a lot of fluctuation. I can think of years, specifically you look at that 2017 team that was as good as anybody in the country. Sure. I look at 2018 as Lincoln Riley's first team, because that was the first time where he got to go through a recruiting cycle, really instill his vision and earn the respect of his players as their head coach as opposed to their play caller. And so I think that 2018 team probably would have won 10 or 11 games in the SEC. 2019, that's probably a 9 or 10 win team. Like I said, 2020, man, like it could have absolutely snowballed off the grid if the Sooners had opened the way that they did and they had to play an SEC schedule as opposed to the Big 12 schedule. I know 2020 was weird, man, but I don't know if they would have won more than 3 or 4 games that year, assuming they got off to the start that they did, and they had to face an SEC schedule as opposed to a Big 12 schedule. So as I look at this last year in 2021, it's just such a wild card, man. Like 2021 was such a weird season, such a bizarre season in so many facets. And so I think as you prepare for SEC play, which I believe will start in 2023, I think that's when Oklahoma and Texas are going to make the move. I think this program is going to be in far better shape under Brent Venables to compete in that conference than they would have been under Lincoln Riley. And I would project that they'll pretty immediately be a double-digit win team and will be contending for conference championships in the SEC sooner rather than later, I would imagine.
Parker, since you answered my next question, I'll ask this. The new Big 12 minus Oklahoma and Texas plus BYU, Houston, UCF, and Cincinnati. So I think the Big 12 did just about as well as they could possibly have in trying to mend its conference, and they did it with quantity over quality to a certain extent, but even the quality was, again, about as good as they could do. How do you view the Big 12 going forward as a Power 5 conference without the 2 big guns? That you lose 20% of your league in terms of membership, but probably, what's your estimation in terms of resources and recruiting and everything, brand image? You're probably losing half the league, if not more.
Yeah, that's the hard part, is that Oklahoma and Texas, in terms of revenue and in terms of public interest, they drive it for the Big 12. They are the biggest driver. And I want to say you lose about 75% of your viewership and revenue when Oklahoma and Texas walk out the door. So I know everybody is going to try to sell the new Big 12, particularly, you're bringing in Cincinnati, you're bringing in UCF, you're bringing in Houston and BYU. All those are teams that have won double-digit games in the very recent past. In fact, all of those teams, save for UCF, I believe, won double-digit games in 2021. So those aren't pushover teams, but by any stretch of the imagination. I just don't know whether anybody's going to take the new Big 12 seriously as a Power 5 conference, because the new SEC is going to be a titan of its own. And if Lincoln Riley continues to take USC on an upward trajectory, Dan Lanning does the same at Oregon, you're talking about the Pac-12 bouncing back into national relevance. The ACC, that's going to be on the upswing once again as well, with Mario Cristobal at Miami and obviously Dabo Swinney at Clemson. I find it hard to believe that Florida State is going to stay down, although I think they'll need a new coaching staff in order to get back to where they once were. So the Pac-12, the ACC, and the SEC, those are all conferences that I think are going to be playing top to bottom very good football within 2 to 3 years. And then obviously you know what you're getting every year in the Big Ten, right? It's Ohio State's league, but you'll have Michigan, Michigan State, occasionally a team like Northwestern or Iowa, Wisconsin. All those teams will be in contention in the top 25, competing for New Year's Six bowls. So I think the Big 12 is going to be hard pressed to stay on par with the rest of the Power Five in that capacity. I'm not saying it can't be done, and that's certainly not a diss at a couple programs that are headed in absolutely the right direction right now in Oklahoma State and Baylor. But I struggle to believe that, at least in an immediate sense, those programs are going to be able to go toe to toe on the big stage with the heavy hitters in the SEC and the Big Ten and the ACC. And for that reason, just because I think if you got to a playoff situation and you had Baylor matched up with the likes of Alabama or Clemson or even Oregon, I don't think those are games that the Big 12 is going to be able to win. And so I think in the long term, the Big 12 has the opportunity to get there. But I think in the short term, a lot of folks nationally are just going to regard the new Big 12 as another group of five conference almost.
Yeah, I think your big stage part of that comment is what makes total sense and is what is going to be the difference right there, because I went back and looked at the 5-year to 10-year track records for those four schools, the four additions to the Big 12 against the Power Five, and they represent themselves rather well. But the bulk of those wins are against, your 500 clubs across the Power Five. So they're going to be able to go out and schedule Big Ten and ACC teams that are 6th, 7th place teams in the conference and win a fair share of those games. But that's not going to help the Big 12. It's going to make it a very competitive league from top to bottom, aside from Kansas, unless they get their act together. You got to think that, man, it's going to be a wild card as to who's going to emerge out of this league every year. It's going to be extremely fun and competitive. But in terms of trying to get somebody up to that upper echelon to take on a Clemson, Ohio State, Alabama in a playoff situation, looks to be a very tall task.
Yeah, and I think that's the issue that the Pac-12 has run into in recent years, right? It cannibalizes itself. The Pac-12 isn't a bad football conference. It's just the fact that there are so many teams that are competitive with one another on a week-to-week basis that, like you said, they can't ever get a team to that upper echelon. The last team that they sent to the college football playoff was Washington in 2016. And that again, that's a conference that you'll watch those teams go into bowl season, and generally they have success, right? Utah gave Ohio State all they could handle and probably should have won that game in the Rose Bowl, just to pick one example. And so, again, it's not to say that the new Big 12 is going to be a bad football conference. I'm just saying I don't think that there will be a team in the new Big 12 that can ascend to that top tier in college football, at least in the short term.
Fun conversation here with Parker Thune. You can catch his complete work at 247 Sports, covering Oklahoma and recruiting. Also, you see right there, he's the host at Sports Talk 1400 and also 947 The Ref. Parker, we appreciate you stopping by, giving us so much time and a great breakdown on Oklahoma and the Big 12.
Of course, man. Always happy to. Take care.